Hello, everyone. Jim Coyle with Indiana Sports Beat Radio. Thank you, as always, for listening to our content. But for more in-depth coverage on the Indiana Hoosiers football, basketball, and recruiting news, go to thehoosier.com on 3. Now with On 3 and great national writers like Zach Osterman, Andy Staples, and Steve Wiltfong for football, Pete Nakos, J.B. Shaw, and Joe Tipton's constantly breaking stories on the basketball side. And the local coverage from Alec Lasley, Kyler Staley, and Zach Browning. You can catch something new every day at thehoosier.com. Go there. Sign up today.
Welcome to Indiana Sports Beat Radio, brought to you by the Hard Truth Distilling Company in Brown County, Indiana.
So for the thousands in attendance and the millions watching around the world.
Touchdown, Indy. Woo! IU, America, they got a football team now.
It's pretty simple. I win. Google me.
You know that I'm the cream of the crop.
Oh. Now, from the Hard Truth Studios, here's Jim Coyle.
Welcome back to the Hard Truth Distilling Company studios on this Friday. Indiana Sports Beat Radio. Jim Coyle with you as always, and joined by Zach Osterman, Indy Stars IU beat writer. And boy, a lot going on the beat this week, Zach, as Indiana basketball, Indiana football, both reaping harvest out of the transfer portal. Of course, more eyes on the basketball program as they are looking to fill an entire new roster with a new coach, and doing quite well with that in the last couple of days, landing another, what is listed as a guard, but he's a 6'7" guy. I just finished talking with Todd Leary, and but you're going to see a lot of positionless basketball, a lot of guys that can play the 2, the 3, and the 4, or the 4 at various times. I think it's going to be a vast departure from what IU fans saw last season. Hell, what they've seen for nearly a decade. Still a few more pieces to fill in on that. Probably a rim protector for someone like Frederico, or whomever they can get. But we're starting to get a pretty good indication of where this roster is headed.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, they've got, if you don't factor in Luke Goody, there's 3 scholarships open. If you do, there's 2. And there's no guarantee, obviously. I mean, Darian DeVries might carry all 13. Some coaches do, some coaches don't. A lot of coaches, I think that tends to be more just kind of like what's available in the moment. I think if you're going to run a motion-based offense, which is what DeVries has talked about as his kind of staple, then it's kind of it's sort of like a what's old is new again thing. We call it positionless basketball. Well, you probably could have called it that when, Bob Knight was running a lot of motion principles in the 70s and 80s, and there were other coaches too. I'm not saying Bob Knight invented all of this. My point is, the whole point of a motion offense is the ball just keeps moving. West Virginia was in something like the 6th percentile for post-ups last season. So the idea, and there's nothing wrong with a post-based offense. I mean, Indiana had plenty of success with it with Trace Jackson Davis. But, the idea of an offense that basically once it gets set in the half court, once it's exhausted all of its potential transition options, comes down, posts up a big man, that big man gets the ball, and then the offense starts operating off of that post up all the way around. That's just a different kind of offense. A motion offense, the ball just keeps moving. And the point is, you've got to have a lot of guys that can be comfortable getting the ball in a lot of different spots on the floor, because in a motion offense, that's what's bound to happen. That is what is going to happen. You aren't going to have guys that are only going to get the ball here. They're only going to see the ball on the wings or coming off of screens, or they're only going to see it when they're handling it or going through ball screens. And you can run, motion concepts can be fit to ball screen offense. They can be, fit to what we used to call dribble drive. I don't think we really call it that anymore. But what you need is a lot of people a lot of players that are capable of moving the ball and moving with the ball and moving without the ball and being comfortable. If suddenly they find the ball in an area on the floor, you wouldn't normally expect maybe a 3 to get the ball, for example, but he's got a shot, they just take it because, they don't look at it and say, well, that's not my shot because I play this position over here. That's a lot of this makes sense based on the way that DeVries has explained sort of his concepts and his approach to his offensive philosophy. I think there are still some questions I have about this roster, especially if Goody comes back. It is, now guaranteed to be more than half comprised of players that will leave after next year because they're out of eligibility, and that's before we consider any transfers, any potential NBA departures, anything like that. It is an offense that I think is still really missing a rim presence. It may be that the staff sees Reed Bailey as that. I'm not sure looking at his film and his numbers that I see him that way, but listen, I'm not a basketball coach, so I'm not going to sit here and say that I know that, so much better than people that spend all their waking hours thinking about it. But you can see there are a lot of things about the way this roster has been built so far that make sense for next year. And even some, when you look at guys like Nick Dorn or Jason Drake or Josiah Miles, that makes sense for, the year after that as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. And but with I was thinking about this with the roster, when you see all these guys are coming in that, well, they've got 1 year of eligibility. And, but at the end of the day, I started to think, you know what? They're all on 1 year contracts in essence, and you're going to have to re-recruit every single one of them regardless, even if they have eligibility left. Although it's easier to probably recruit a kid that's already in your camp than to go out and find someone else. I understand that. And I guess that right now they're just so intent maybe on trying to get the pieces they need for this first. You only get one chance to make a first impression. I don't know if that's the overweighing factor on how it's being put together, or this is what we're able to get done at the moment. Either way, I think obviously the most important thing is, does he get the pieces he needs to be successful and to be competitive in a league that's going to be competitive next season, and to do it in a way that it definitely has not been done at Indiana in quite some time, but it's also not a typical Big Ten style of basketball.
No, I mean, listen, I think for a long time, not for a long time, I think we always sort of ask this question of like, do you try to win early? Is that cutting corners? I think to your point, rosters are so transient anymore that it's hard to sort of point to any given season and say that's the one where you should be good. I mean, if anything, there's probably an extent to which a coach would say, my remit is to be good immediately because that's what's expected, because that's the climate that's out there. Kentucky did it. Michigan did it. I mean, we can go up and down the list of teams. There were a number of teams. Ole Miss, I think, kind of flattened that curve pretty quickly when Chris Beard got there. Obviously, St. John's only needed 2 years under Rick Pitino. In this era, it's expected that you win at a pretty high level and you win pretty quickly. Now, that may lead you to make some decisions about your roster that, ultimately you're going to have to go back and, I'm getting a new front door today and they're banging around out there in the background. That may lead you to make some decisions that you eventually have to kind of reconcile with later on, like taking all these players, that are older. But if you're Indiana, I think you also always have the assurance of the resources necessary to go rebuild. And, you think about, like Michigan's probably a decent example. That Michigan team, Vlad Golden's going to be gone. I think Danny Wolf declared for the draft. I think Will Cheddar's going to be gone. I know Namari Burnett announced he's coming back. They've had 1 or 2 defections in the portal. I think Trey Donaldson went in the portal. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think, we used to quantify momentum in part based on a program's roster construction. And we used to say, like, part of your momentum is the momentum of your program is whether you're recruiting, retaining, and developing your roster well. And I just don't know that we can see it quite that way anymore because, Michigan is, I think, a good example, too, on the front side of this, not just the back side. They're having, they've put together one of the best portal classes in the country. Well, one of the things that's enabled them to do that is that in Dusty May's first year, they won 27 games. They won the Big Ten tournament. They nearly won the Big Ten, if not for kind of a late season dip. They went to the Sweet 16. So in the portal, Michigan's got tons of agency. My understanding is they've got a really healthy, sort of resource pool to draw from in terms of what they're able to offer kids in compensation. And so you're not bothered by losing all these players. I mean, like, again, Michigan's going to have lost, something like, if I'm looking at their usage rates right now in KenPom, Michigan's going to have lost something like 4 of its top 6 players from last season. And I think 3 of its 5 starters, most regular starters. But Michigan, if we 10 years ago, if a team endured that, whether it was via the draft or transfers or whatever, we'd say, boy, this is a real setback. This is
they'd be over. Their season would be over before it began.
Like, this is going to take a real good coaching job to kind of get it back together. Now we look at it and we say, yes, but the momentum remains because they've had success, because the coach is well respected, and because under this new sort of approach to roster building, roster construction, roster maintenance, you're able to just reload again. And there are going to be years for any of these coaches where it doesn't quite work. Sure. And that may be the case for Indiana next year. But I think that old way of thinking about a program's momentum being tied directly to its roster construction and projection just doesn't quite fit the modern game and the modern sort of structure of how you put a roster together.
And Indiana has gone about this. Darian DeVries and his staff, they've been very quiet and under the radar as much as any team has and as much as you can be at Indiana, but they have done a pretty damn good job of doing most of these things under the radar.
No, they have. And I mean, listen, the portal moves fast. I think anymore, it's also kind of down to the player and his representation, how much they want to play out in public in terms of recruitments. But I think it's also just kind of one of those things where there are so many of these players moving on, looking for something new. Like, if you tried to sort of be really public about every visit you took, every trip you took, every call, like, I mean, the system would just completely overload. We wouldn't make it, I think, is what I'm trying to say, to the end of May without everyone's head exploding. So I just think that I think there's an extent to which this is probably just the way it's going to work now, when there are so many players in the portal at any given time, and they're all taking visits and they're all moving around. This stuff's just going to happen faster. And if it happens faster, it's going to happen quieter because there's just going to be less time for information to get out. Now, I do think this staff has been able to move, in relative secrecy. I think this staff is also, and this is, not something a reporter loves, but I think this staff has also done a good job of just kind of keeping its business to itself and not sort of telegraphing, well, these are the guys we're going to go for, and we're going to get him, and we're going to get him, and we got a connection means we're going to get him, whatever. There's been just as much speculation about, like, players that aren't even in the portal that I think people just thought Indiana might have a line on because of an assistant coach or something like that. There's been as much of that as there's been, hard information that turned out to be true. And I think that's the staff's preference and its ability to work quietly. But I also think there's just an extent to which in the modern game here, in the modern construction of the transfer portal, this is all going to move so fast that it's just going to happen a little more quietly than what we're used to.
Yeah, Terhune Tiger asking, will they fit together? Can they defend? And everybody is only talking about shooting. Well, first of all, I think the reason for so much talk about shooting is because you haven't seen it in a decade at Indiana. So that's why the talk about that and how that can change what you're doing offensively. Yeah, of course they're going to have to play defense. I mean, Sam Alexis is someone who is probably is going to be looked at as much for defense as he is offense.
Can I share an image here? Is that possible?
What's that?
Is it possible for me to share an image here?
Yeah, sure.
How do I do that?
Hope.
I think
go down to where it says present.
Hold on. I think I gotta download it onto my computer. This is a meme that I've made because I'm just that creative.
You made a meme?
I made it for a buddy who was complaining about the defense. If anybody has, let's see if this works. Can you bring this
there
up?
You go.
I made this.
What the pack line is for.
I made this for a buddy. I mean, listen, I know the famous Mad Men scene. I know the pack line is a bit of a dirty term after Archie Miller's tenure at Indiana. I would point out defense was, and I think Tony Adranya's talked about this too on Twitter and things. Defense was never really Archie Miller's problem. Like if you go back and look at Archie's teams historically, I mean his teams finished 43rd, 22nd, 32nd, and 65th in overall adjusted defensive efficiency. Like those are good numbers. And that year that they finished 65th, by the way, they were actually demonstrably better relative to the competition in Big Ten play. They were 4th in Big Ten games alone in adjusted defensive efficiency. And I would argue that a lot of those defensive numbers would have been better if they were not constantly under such significant stress from Indiana's offense. So basically what I'm trying to say is if Indiana had not been so frustratingly inconsistent scoring the ball, it probably would have been better defensively as well, because it would not have felt quite so stressed around basically having to win games with defense because it couldn't score. I don't think Darian DeVries' team, at least next year, is going to have a ton of trouble shooting and scoring. Now you kind of go to the other end of the floor, which is actually sort of where maybe he's had historically a little bit more success. Obviously, West Virginia was very, very good defensively last season, had to be because Tucker DeVries was out. The pack line is, I mean, it works. Like Brad Stevens ran the pack line. Tony Bennett ran the pack line. If it's
successfully to a national championship.
And I would argue that even under Archie Miller, the pack line worked, at least at a basic level. The team as constructed just wasn't good enough to take enough stress off that defense to make more of it in other areas. But Archie Miller had 2 defenses or 3 top 50 defenses and 2 top 35 defenses. Those are good numbers. And again, even you want to go some years. I mean, there were years where Indiana was one of the best teams in the Big Ten defensively, even just in Big Ten games alone, when obviously the level of competition is higher. My point is the pack line can work. I do think this team, for my money, could still really use more rim presence. And I know Alexis gives you some of that. It's also kind of been widely acknowledged that, and this is something that's just going to happen, just like it happens in prep recruiting, it happens in portal recruiting too. It's kind of widely sort of agreed upon that this is just not a great, like sort of, if you want to call it like a portal class at the 5. There aren't a ton of really sort of compelling, to use the old positional term, centers that have gone through this portal class. A lot of the ones that were interesting have been snapped up. So, sometimes you just have to figure out how to cut your cloth according to what you feel is available to you. And I'm, for example, when I look at his film and his numbers, I'm a little bit skeptical of the idea that Reed Bailey can play too much of the 5. But the pack line is a defense that's kind of built around the whole mitigating the weaknesses of the individuals. So, maybe as time goes on, it'll be proven that some of these players fit that a little bit better.
The sum is greater than the parts.
Yes, and that is one of the basic theories behind the pack line, is the idea that you're not extending the defense out too much and asking any one player to just be like an elite sort of ball stopper. It's that the whole system compensates. It can accentuate the strengths of really good defenders, but it compensates for the weaknesses of ones that aren't as good. But when I bring that up just to like, the reason I sent that meme to my buddy was just to sort of make the point, like the pack line isn't, I know it's a dirty word around here. Somebody said like it's a, we're banned from saying pack line or hump. The pack line is not it is a defense that works if coached correctly. It is a defense that I would argue worked for Archie Miller. Archie's problem was his teams just could not shoot or score the ball with any consistency. And so you wound up looking at those defenses, I think, at times, and feeling like you saw weakness. But I think part of the reason you saw weakness was because when Indiana did play well defensively, Indiana made nothing of it at the other end of the floor. I mean, I can remember back to games that Indiana lost to Purdue 48-46 or Ohio State 55-52. Obviously, I'm looking at them right now. Games that Indiana should have won and played well in defensively against good teams and just could not score the ball to save its life. If this team can shoot and score at the level that we think it can, the pack line probably works better at the other end of the floor because you're not placing so much stress on your defense that you just can't possibly afford to not get a few stops.
This weekend, a huge weekend outside of what's all going on that we've been talking about, because Zach is also a little 500 coach. Who's your team again? I always forget.
Phi Kappa Psi.
Man, what are the odds going in? Where do you guys feel? How do you feel?
We'll be in and around.
I like that. In and around. I love that.
We've got 3 back from last year. 1 rookie who's young but promising. There's some teams that are probably a little bit more experienced than us in terms of overall races and things like that. But listen, I mean, I've come into races the presumptive favorite and lost. I've come into races as a coach, with kind of nobody talking about us and done really well, been on the last lap, been in the mix, been in the field sprint or in a position to win late. The reality is every race is a little different. There's 1,000 things that can go wrong that can derail your day, that are completely outside your control. And you just kind of, the race is no different than any other sport. It's you just take it a lap at a time. You try to solve the problems in front of you. I always say we'll need a little luck to have a good race day, but you always
got to have luck to win anything. Yeah.
There's no.
The weather's going to be perfect. It looks like it's going to be
no
rain.
First thing we got to hope is that we can get the women's race in today, because it would be. It's not ideal. The contingency plan is to run both races tomorrow. I'm checking the weather again. It does look like actually, I think the highest percentage chance of rain after the 3:00 hour when the thunderstorms seem to start breaking up is only 40%. They'll run in rain. What we need is for the rain to move off early. The women's race goes off usually around 4:30, 4:40. They'll have to dry the track off. They have those big vacuums or those big blowers that they use at IndyCar.
NASCAR. That's like NASCAR, baby.
Yeah, they got to drive that stuff into the infield so it drains off. But as long as they can run in rain, as long as it doesn't storm tonight, they'll get the women's race in tonight. You just want to be able to prep the track fully, because each race tears it up pretty good. Running both in one day is really difficult, but that is the contingency plan if they can't get the women's race in today. So hopefully, hopefully the storms stay away. Hopefully they break up and let's go racing.
Yeah, it's dancing all around us, but it is that time of year. It's the month of May, almost. Indy 500. We've got the little 500 should become the official kickstart for the Indianapolis 500.
I'm fine with that. I mean, I
think
think
that would be
for some of it, it probably is.
It's a perfect timing. Seriously, although they did have practice this week twice, yesterday and the day before. What a great kickoff that would be. Well, brother, I wish you and your team the best of luck. Hope you pull in a win. I know it's tough, but enjoy it and appreciate you as always.
Absolutely, Jim. Thanks for having me as always.
Thank you, sir. Zach Osterman, the Indy Stars IU beat writer. Up next, Alec Lasley from the Hoosier.com as we continue to roll on from the Hard Truth Distilling Company studios. Hello, everyone. Jim Coyle with Indiana Sports Beat Radio. Thank you, as always, for listening to our content. But for more in-depth coverage on the Indiana Hoosiers football, basketball, and recruiting news, go to thehoosier.com on 3. Now with On 3 and great national writers like Ari Wasserman, Andy Staples, and Steve Wiltfong for football, Pete Nakos, J.B. Shaw, and Joe Tipton's constantly breaking stories on the basketball side. And the local coverage from Alec Lasley, Kyler Staley, and Zach Browning. You can catch something new every day at thehoosier.com. Go there, sign up today.